I've been trying to write something for a couple of weeks now about Sekiro Shadows Die Twice because I'm having a really hard time doing justice to the way in which this game works on my powers of imagination. I'm trying to get to the bottom of one feeling in particular. As corny as it is to admit this, when I play this game, I find myself actually halfway believing that I am a master sword fighter. Sekiro makes me think that I actually know how to fight with a sword, like, really well. I think what's actually happening is that this game might have awoken a long, dormant, deep-seated childhood fantasy that I developed as a Star Wars-obsessed little nerd who enacted little lightsaber fights with a broom in the kitchen while the rest of my family was out watching my sister play soccer on a Saturday afternoon. Playing Sekiro today kind of scratches that very same itch as swinging a broom and making vroom vroom noises in my kitchen back in the day. Except that luckily, now that I've reawakened this fantasy, I've discovered a slightly more socially acceptable outlet for those desires in the form of a video game. Believe me when I tell you though, I'm not terribly good at Sekiro, as you'll probably notice if you watch my footage, but this game just has a sneaky way of letting me inhabit the fantasy of becoming a masterful shinobi. And I desperately want to understand how it puts me into this state of mind, because I think if I can figure out how Sekiro causes that impression, I might be able to understand a little bit better why I have this intuition that Sekiro is the greatest sword fighting game that I've ever played. I think the best way to approach how Sekiro works its magic is to start with the emotional highlights of the game, and then to work backwards and discover their causes. And it's really easy to know where to start. It's the boss fights. The bosses in Sekiro consistently transport me to another plane of existence entirely. The combat is so intense, the pacing so relentlessly fast, and the timing required to make any progress at all is so exacting that I fall into some kind of gamer trance every time I square off with one of them. I'm honestly not even totally sure I'd call it a fun state of mind per se. It's something a little bit beyond fun. It's more like that zone of unbroken attention that you'd fall into in a real life or death situation, where the stakes are so high that you achieve that zen-like clarity of mind where all of your attention is gathered together into the single task of staring down your enemy and reading their intentions. That's how I feel when I'm in a Sekiro boss fight. It happens every time without fail. And when I think about it, this trance that combat in Sekiro constantly casts me into probably has a lot to do with the reason why the game keeps making me halfway believe that I actually know how to fight with a sword. It's because I'm in this state of mind that I've always kind of imagined must be the mindset of a great duelist locked in a great duel. And I think my unconscious mind desperately wishes that that was what was really happening, because like I said, this game seems to have awoken a really old childhood wish to be a swordsman or a Jedi or some kind of romantic heroic archetype in the movies. Now, I'm coming to Sekiro as a fan of FromSoftware's other work. Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and Elden Ring were all major events in my career as a gamer. But in my experience, and to my surprise, Sekiro achieves a different level of excitement that just reaches a little bit deeper into my soul than any of FromSoftware's other work. And I think that I've worked out the reason why from a mechanical point of view. Part of the story is pretty obvious, I think, and you'll find people on YouTube mention it all the time. Sekiro forces you to play a lot more aggressively than any other FromSoft game, so you're constantly just blasting into the thick of things, and the game just has a faster pace than even Bloodborne, which is the major runner-up in the series. And a faster pace is obviously a big part of what makes Sekiro feel like it's just going to the next level as far as intensity is concerned. But the real secret to what elevates Sekiro into its own echelon, in my opinion anyway, is that it doesn't skimp out on defensive aspects of combat either. I would even go so far as to argue that it demands a more complex defensive playstyle than any of the other entries in the Soulsborne series. And that really surprised me. I think going into Sekiro, I had expected that there ought to be some kind of inverse relationship between offense and defense, so that if the game asks me to do more of one, it's going to ask me to do less of the other. But Sekiro breaks that rule, and it ratchets both up to 11. And the next thing I want to do in this video is tell you a little bit about how it does this, because I think the total effect of this double escalation of combat intensity has a lot to do with the reason why Sekiro reaches so deep into my psyche when I'm locked in some of these combat encounters. If you ever dig into what the FromSoftware community has to say about Sekiro, one of the common talking points, which is definitely a major truth, is that the game forces you to unlearn certain habits that you pick up while playing the other Soulsborne games. The main habit is a tendency that most players, including myself, develop in the other games to rely on your dodge as your primary defensive tool. The way to master a boss in Bloodborne or Elden Ring, say, is to master your dodge timings. And as long as you can do that, as long as you've committed all the relevant dodge timings to muscle memory, you're golden. You can beat literally anything. But this isn't really the case for Sekiro. It's definitely true that you have a dodge button in Sekiro, and it's definitely true that you're going to use it sometimes, but it's not going to carry you through every fight. Enemies have a lot of attacks that you're going to have to parry instead, and even that is not as simple as it sounds, because there's two different kinds of parry with two different kinds of input that you'll need to master for different situations. And then on top of that, enemies also like to do a certain sweeping attack that you can only avoid by jumping. So to really get to grips with a boss, you'll frequently have to rely on 4 different defensive techniques: 2 parries, a jump, and a dodge. Of course, someone might want to argue that this isn't so different from Elden Ring because you can parry and jump in Elden Ring, but the thing is, Elden Ring and the other Soulsborne games, they don't force you to do these things. You can always get by just by using your dodge. And for me, and I imagine for most players, what that means in practice is we only do the dodge. Because there's just this funny human psychological tendency to just learn the things you have to do and find a way to make do with that. And Sekiro makes you learn all of its defensive techniques. And once you've incorporated all 4 of these defensive techniques into the rhythm of combat and feel comfortable with them and start performing them fluidly, it makes a world of difference in the way that combat feels in the heat of the moment. And that's because it adds a new split-second choice that you have to make every time the enemy attacks. You have to choose one of your 4 defensive techniques, and you have to choose quickly and on the basis of your enemy's body language. That choice is an extra mental operation that you just didn't have to make in any of the other Soulsborne games. And that's a lot to ask if you're dealing with the aggressive rhythm of combat. If the enemy's coming at you with all the speed they can muster, that means you're making an extra choice once or twice every second. And the upshot is, combat ends up feeling more tactical and a little bit more intellectual because you're just doing more thinking. And at the same time, it's also more intense because you're cramming all that split-second mental activity into a tiny quantity of temporal space. And that's super hard. So for all these reasons, I would argue that Sekiro demands greater defensive sophistication than any of the other Soulsborne games. But of course, when we're discussing the ways in which Sekiro ramps up the complexity of the defensive aspects of combat, we also have to remind ourselves that the game is also forcing you at the same time to play more aggressively than in any of the other Souls games. I'd go so far as to say that Sekiro rewards a total gonzo aggressive playstyle, a non-stop relentless tempo of rapid-fire violence. In the best boss fights, constantly attacking becomes a form of defense in itself because the real goal is to put the boss on the backstep so that they don't have time to enter an attack animation, or at least you can minimize the number of attacks that you can expect from them. Not that playing aggressively is going to relieve you of the burden of playing defensively altogether. On the contrary, depending on the boss, you're only ever going to be able to get somewhere between 2 and 4 blows in at a time before they find an opening to attack and put you back on the defense. And that's the moment where you have to make that perfectly timed split-second decision about whether you have to parry in turn, or jump, or dodge, or find some other way of dealing with the oncoming attack. And if you can time this successfully, well, that means you fluidly shift the tide of battle back again in your favor, and put your enemy on the backstep once again, land a few more blows before the cycle repeats again. And here you fall into this incredibly satisfying rhythm where combat has this ebb and flow that moves now forward, now back, now attacking, now defending, and so on and so forth. It feels a lot like the kind of sword fight that you'd see in a movie, where the tide of battle is constantly shifting back and forth. And you get that beautifully dramatic, fluid motion that expresses the struggle between 2 great and equal foes in combat. The thing that makes Sekiro truly unique as an action game is the total experience that emerges once you've mastered and integrated the offensive and defensive components of combat and packaged them into a single fluid playstyle. You get something that looks a lot like the great lightsaber fights in Star Wars, a fast-paced, highly aggressive battle where blades lock once or twice every second and where the advantage constantly shifts back and forth. It ebbs and flows with every passing moment. You're making a new choice every second whether to attack or dodge or parry parry or block, and you have to concentrate with everything you have just so you can read your enemy and anticipate their next move. And when you're in that zone, you're doing two things at once. You're making split-second choices in the present based on the information you glean from your enemy's telegraph animations, while at the same time you're always thinking 1 second ahead about your next move and how to achieve the position that you'll need to retain your advantage. And it's all happening so fast that there's just no room in your mind to think about anything else. And earlier in this video, I said that the boss fights in Sekiro cast me into a kind of trance. They give me that zen-like clarity of mind where your awareness is gathered entirely into the present moment. And I think that we've actually sorted out the reason why Sekiro is able to put me into that state of mind, and probably you too if you've ever played the game. It's just so demanding on a moment-to-moment level. There's so much decision-making to do, so many factors to keep track of, that there's no room in your tiny human brain to contain anything else. And so you get swept up into this flow state of pure presence. As a result of all this, I cannot really say that Sekiro Shadows Die Twice is the game you want to play after a tough day where you just want to sit back and relax. And there are definitely hard limits to the amount of time that I can give it in a single dedicated play session because it's just so taxing to engage with this game's mechanics. But rarely does a game have the power to absorb me the way that Sekiro does when I am playing. And it's the first thing I'd recommend to anyone who ever spent some time in their childhood repurposing a broom as an imaginary sword, or who perhaps in their adult life has become a person of culture who enjoys samurai cinema from the mid-20th century or from the 70s. Sekiro captures the same part of the imagination in a way that very few video games, if any, can accomplish. And I would also argue that, considered strictly as a combat system, it is FromSoftware's most focused and greatest achievement to date. So basically, what I'm saying is I frickin' love this game. And I made this whole entire video just to tell you that. So, hope you liked it. My name's Chumpy, and thanks for watching.